At the time, we thought the Great Recession was a once-in-a-generation, hell, maybe once-in-a-century economic disaster.
As anxious and unsettled as maybe I've ever felt.
How am I going to make enough to really feel comfortable, or, just to make ends meet at that point?
I just felt really betrayed by the system.
For those of us that graduated into the worst economy since the Great Depression, many of us haven't gotten over it.
I had this idea and this dream and this vision of where my life was going to go. And then I had to put it on hold because there weren't jobs out there.
I still haven't recovered from 2008.
Recessions, while terrible for most everyone, are particularly awful for those just entering the job market.
If you enter the labor market at the wrong time, which this generation did, you're going to have ongoing problems. They're not transitory, they're ongoing.
And right as some of us millennials were finally getting back on our feet, bam, pandemic.
I think it's fair to say it couldn't have come at a worse time for them.
For the first time in modern memory, we're having to confront an ugly truth, that my generation will be worse off than my parents and grandparents were. Not because of anything we did or didn't do, but simply because we were born in the wrong years.
What our parents told us what our adult life should be, it just didn't work out.
Unless you have a private yacht to escape to, this pandemic has been excruciating for just about everyone. It's too early to know which generations will be most injured by this. That'll take years to sort out. But one thing we do know is that the 1-2 punch of the Great Recession, followed by COVID-19 in the span of just 11 years, is an economic challenge different from anything we've seen before. And as fate would have it, the timing is uniquely bad for my age group.
Millennials have lower rates of employment overall. They have lower earnings, lower savings, and then layered on top of that, they have debt, which of course is deeply related to that lower employment and lower earnings that they carry with them over time. And they're carrying all of that into this particular economic crisis.
The ethos of America is upward mobility. The American dream is built on the promise that each generation builds upon the previous one, and quality of life improves steadily. For as far back as U.S. Census data goes, that's been true. Household wages have risen relative to previous generations.
That is, until Gen X handed the baton to us.
Across the education spectrum, we're earning less than the previous generation. But why? We're the most diverse, most educated, most productive generation in American history.
But from an economic standpoint, we could not have been dealt a worse hand. Twice. And as I learned from the experts, it all has to do with timing.
When a recession happens, the impacts are often uneven. These cohorts who are coming of age during economic downturns, unfortunately experience really strong negative economic impacts. They come out to a very difficult labor market, and it's hard to get a good first job. It may be hard to get a job at all, but if they do get a job, they're likely to get a job that's maybe lower pay and lower quality than the job that they would have gotten had they graduated a bit earlier.
In 2008, 9, or 10, I think most of us were pretty happy to have a lousy first job, just so long as we had one. What I didn't realize at the time, though, is that that first job has major impacts that ripple out across your entire career.
It is true that the trajectory of your economic future and in some ways your life is altered permanently on average. The first job that you get sets you up for the second job, which sets you up for the third job, right? And so where you start in that career trajectory really matters.
I checked in with half a dozen or so of my fellow millennials. Some I knew, some I didn't. And their experiences bore that out across the board.
I either had to prepare myself for like a long stretch of not being able to work when I graduated 2010, or, just trying to scrap for anything possible at that point.
There were no jobs, and I remember being friends with seniors who were getting ready to graduate. They were panicked that they couldn't find jobs. And so they either had to work for free or work in a different industry. And the same thing happened to me when I finally finished college in 2010.
The legal market just completely blew up. It went from, jobs everywhere at high pay to there aren't any jobs. Seasoned attorneys don't have work. New attorneys can't get work. And it was just chaos.
That was the first time that I ever remember battling something that sounded like depression or anxiety. I was 30 pounds heavier than I am now and had high blood pressure at the age of 27. I remember the mental and the physical toll that it took was pretty profound.
Compared to Gen X, twice as many millennials took on student debt to go to college or grad school. And for those who took on debt, on average, it was 50% more than Gen Xers. It also doesn't help that college was dramatically more expensive for us, about twice as much. For many of us, our starting salaries were lower than what you'd normally expect. Millennials earn 20% less than baby boomers did at the same age. We can't buy a house. We're less able to save for a rainy day. We hesitated to get married or have kids.
They've been left in a situation where they're sort of being held responsible as though their actions are what caused the circumstances in which they find themselves, when in fact it was actually decisions that were made at a much higher level.
So we got dealt a crappy hand. Our timing was monumentally unlucky, and there was very little we could do about it. For most of us, this completely changed our mindset and outlook for the future.
Individuals like millennials who come of age during economic downturns are more pessimistic about the economy and their economic outlook, but they're also more pessimistic about their future chances of success, the likelihood that they will be happy in their old age, or the likelihood that they will retire comfortably.
Do you feel like this country and our economic policies work for you? Do you feel like you're set up for success in the modern economy in America?
If you were to ask me a couple months ago, I would say fairly yes. But now I don't think so.
Those two events, the relatively close proximity in time between the two, has shaken a lot of confidence that I have in the fundamentals of our system.
I just felt really betrayed by the system, even though I was like complying to what is to be like legitimate in this system.
These feelings of angst and insecurity translates to us taking fewer risks. We're less likely to start a business, more hesitant to buy a house or have kids, the normal things that power the American economy. And it's become all but a pipe dream for so many of us. And that was before COVID landed the second of the 1-2 punch.
Merely a decade later, as many of these folks are getting back onto their feet and getting back onto a career trajectory that maybe they expected to be on 5 years ago, they're getting hit again. And that sort of 1-2 punch, I think, is something that we've never experienced before, and that is likely to have pretty devastating economic impacts for this generation.
The stability that I was like fighting to get, like I did finally get when I turned 30, like the week I turned 30. And when the pandemic happens, for it to stop and be stalled, that is pretty traumatic. You know, I don't know where to go from here. It's always been a big punch in the face every couple of years.
Hillary lost her job and said she's still waiting on unemployment checks. Eric contracted COVID-19, and after 10 days fighting it, recovered, went back to work, and was laid off a couple days later.
This roller coaster keeps going up, you know, when's it gonna come down? Is it gonna come down? And now it's like, all right, it came down hard.
Brooks is on a 1-year contract as a professor for next year. But with steep cuts likely to hit higher education, long-term job security is no guarantee. Robbie was scarred enough from the Great Recession that he chose a completely different area of law to practice, specifically so he could weather a recession.
I still haven't recovered from 2008, and I'm kind of lost of where I'm at now.
When I asked my larger friend group about plans for getting married, buying a house, or having a kid, many of them straight up laughed at me.
When I asked about their outlook for the future, almost none of them were outright optimistic. This is partly why Medicare for All, canceling student loan debt, and other big structural changes proposed by politicians like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and AOC resonate with young folks across the country. They're the ones who the system doesn't seem to be working for.
Those who haven't fared well under the existing set of arrangements tend to blame themselves. That's part of the American sort of self-reliance ethic. I think there has been a change in that sensibility and a greater recognition that some of the problems that this generation has been experiencing are not due to individual failings, but rather to systemic ones.
The individuals who experience economic downturns during their impressionable years are more likely to believe that economic success is the result of luck rather than hard work.
The problems are reaching such a level that it's hard to see yourself as the only person who chose your way into a particular situation, because it's the same situation in which you see your friends and your relatives.